We still have three undefeated teams through week 3 in Rhode Island, and those three teams won by an average of 28 points. But it does set up a battle of the undefeated. So one of them will definitely lose next week as the Halfway Crooks get ready to take on Lob City. But it is also the Road Dogs who improved to 3-0 with a 34-point win, the largest win in week 3. And so we're going to break down all the week 3 action here on the week 3 post-game show. I have Ryan and Chris here joining us, and I don't want to start with my team, even though he did score 100 points, as Ryan noted, for the first time any team this season has scored 100. It's not the first time in the league, though, I promise. Lob City will have some stuff to say about that. They used to be a repeat 100-point offender, I guess you can say. But let's start with the Road Dogs, who did win by the most. And I know both of my analysts were over on court one, so I can definitely jump in on this one. But the Road Dogs, I mean, I think the Road Dogs, and to be fair, they're a new team. They've played 3 games together in this league, but they are 3-0. And so anytime you can get a win like that, you definitely take it. But I would say they are the team that probably the least amount of people expected to be 3-0, right? You kind of expect some of those returning teams to kind of get into things a little more quickly. But it is the Road Dogs winning in week 3 over, I definitely clicked on the wrong game. Give me 1 second. The Road Dogs winning in week 3 over the Gym Rats. There we go. I was like, that margin was not big enough. Over the Gym Rats, 88-54. And it was a battle. I know that they definitely, shot it better, and we'll kind of get to some of the stats in a second. But even during that post-game interview, they talked about how Mark Washington and his 3-point shooting was key, going 4 of 7 from 3 and leading the way with 24 points. But yeah, I mean, really 18-10 after that first quarter for the Road Dogs, and then, was able to get that lead to double digits at halftime. But a big third quarter where they nearly doubled their lead, at a 29-14 edge in that third quarter. And, for the Road Dogs, I mean, they have some tests coming up, and we're kind of going to preview some of the future weeks as well here, kind of as we talk about these matchups and these undefeated teams, as well as the Regulators, who got their first win in week 3. But the Road Dogs next week will take on the Air Mambas, who just lost this week, but are one of those returning teams and kind of starting to figure some things out. And then the Road Dogs still have matchups with Lob City and the Halfway Crooks coming up down the road. So we will get to see every team play everybody, and then some teams do play twice. But kind of just listing off more of the Road Dogs here. I mean, Rion Watson, his second game in the league, 21 points and very effective shooting. He's kind of one of the main ball handlers, which has been huge for that team, especially in a league like this where it's a little more fast-paced. And got to shout out Jalen Ardrey again, 9 of 13 this week for 18 points. So kind of they've been consistent. And let's just mention the last player in double figures for them as well, Anthony Lyons with 11. So really some balanced scoring from them. And again, let's kind of go over who they played really quick. And then if anybody, I'm going to put you guys on the spot if you've seen them. I think Chris saw them last week, so you can kind of touch on the Road Dogs a little bit here. And that's kind of how we'll do this. But, last week they took down Unaffiliated by 8. So a battle for them. And in week 1, their first game, they beat Always by 4, right? So a win's a win. That's not what I'm getting at. But I'll throw it to Chris here because he did see them last week. I mean, as far as the Road Dogs and even looking at that box score really quick, what have they done well through the first 3 weeks, Chris, that, has allowed them to be 3-0? That's the easy question, but makes you believe that they can keep on winning in this league?
I think it took obviously a few weeks for them to become comfortable with playing together, obviously being a new team. But I think the biggest thing is that they found their identity and who their best players are. Obviously being with Mark Washington, but obviously the other guys like Jalen Ardrey, like we talked about, he was big last week. I think just finding this identity and having these specific players be like know their role, and over time it became more comfortable for them because, as we mentioned, they won by 34 this week and only by 8 last week and then 4 the week before. So I think it just took a little bit of shuffling for them to trying to figure out where they kind of stood and like where the players were. But I think once they figured that out, they really knew what was most successful for them, and they were finally able to put like their best performance this week.
And I think that goes for a lot of teams, right? Especially for a newer team in the league. But you talk about any of the teams where they have some new players, right? And people are trying to figure out, when do I play? When do I not? What am I supposed to do on this team? Maybe I can score 25 when it's my own team, but I'm here with a couple other good players. And so I kind of have to fit in and figure out how we all can be best used. And that's a really good point for the Road Dogs. And so again, undefeated, one of the three undefeateds, and they took down the Gym Rats. So Brandon Whitman, 9 points. I know I shout him out because he exploded in week 1. And then notably last week on the show, I said, told me after week 2, they were ready for me. Like, what the heck is this? Like, it was much more difficult. So it's so funny. I mentioned Lucas Panacchia last week from last season, had a very similar thing. And they're both good players. And I think Lucas was close to an all-star. Close to an all-star. I don't believe he was an all-star last year, but Brandon Whitman's still a huge part of that team, but only 9 points in week 3. Dylan Gallagher led the way, who we've talked about for the Gym Rats, and Thomas DeAndra in his second game, 11 points, 5 of 13. So I think, the Road Dogs had a little bit of size to kind of go up against Thomas DeAndrea in this one, where last week he was a little more free to have his way in the paint. So yeah, like I talked about, the Road Dogs in week 4 get the Air Mambas. The Gym Rats take on the Regulators, who did win in week 3. We're going to get to them in a second because I do want to get to Lob City, and this is where I can kind of get to my 2 analysts here. So usually Lob City is talked about near the end because we end up, just from how history has gone, talk about them the longest throughout the season. This year they, are 3-0. And again, they have a huge test next week, which I will put you guys on the spot for at the end. Don't worry. We're gonna preview that game a little bit because it is 2 undefeated teams. But Lob City takes down All Waves in week 3, 82-59. The smallest of the margins of the undefeated teams, just by 23 points. But again, I think they were in control most of that game. So let's kind of go to Ryan here first on Lob City and get him in here. 3-0, the defending champs. They've looked good. Ryan, had you seen them before week 3?
No, this was my first. Actually, yeah, no, this was my first time. This was my first time.
All right, perfect. So what are your first impressions of Lob City as they get that 3rd win?
When I first look at them, I see like their identity is mainly, their defensive identity has been amazing. They play well on defense in transition, back and forth. They got a lot of big men that can kind of shot block, and I think that's what's great about Lob City. They just aren't sure they got the offense that they need, but I think everything kind of comes into play. If you don't have a good defense, your offense isn't really gonna develop more because that's kind of the way I kind of see it when it comes to basketball. When you're in transition, I think especially defensively, I think this is kind of what it's the fundamentals that kind of gets through going, and I think that's kind of what Lob City does. They focus on the fundamentals and they kind of get things going, especially on defense.
Sorry, I was still muted. A lot of it in this game was defense for Lob City for sure. And I think that's kind of where they got things going. And that's really what they talked about in that post-game interview, right? Jordan Grace with 9 points did the interview and kind of talked about that defense, talked about wanting to get out and run. And I think a lot of those things are Lob City staples. Colin Burns, another Lob City staple, led the way with 29 points in this one. Joe Secator with 21 as well. And so really, only 1 3-pointer made. And you kind of asked them that too, Ryan, in that post-game interview, but it's the same old tale with them, and they've been successful, and they're the 3-time defending champs for a reason, right? Take it inside, attack, play defense, get out and run, get easy ones, and I think any team would take that, and that's Lob City's game. And for All Waves here, Josh DePina with 34, and he had a huge night, made 3 threes, and then really everybody else kind of followed in behind that. And so, Chris, talking about Lob City, you can touch on All Waves a little bit too, who, do fall to 0-3. We'll talk about who the teams play next in a second, but really this game and your key for Lob City, taking down All Waves.
I think Lob City's first quarter, I think they were just trying to get used to the flow of the game, like we talked about before, and just trying to like kind of crash the boards and kind of figure out what their identity was. I think the thing that really works well for Lob City is that they're probably just the most deep team out of any team in the league. They have a lot of good guys in their team, like the top 5 guys in their team score almost double-digit points every week, so it definitely doesn't hurt. And like we said, they just out-rebound a lot of the teams that they've already played before. And I think the All Waves played well in the first quarter because they were kind of able to match the tone that Lob City was playing with, whether for whatever reason really specifically. But I think All Waves knew what they were trying to do from the beginning, and I think that they were playing well for the first half. But I think at once the game got kind of out of the way, they kind of had to try and make up where they could, and that just wasn't happening for them.
And I think that's kind of, I always go back to this is just kind of how it's been. But the teams, can usually hang with them for a quarter or two, and that's kind of a normal thing. But keeping that up throughout the game is the most difficult part against Lob City. And so just to kind of touch on those rebounds, I mean, 22-19, but it definitely felt and probably was a little bigger than that, for Lob City using their size, having so many options like you talked about. Lob City next week, we talked about it, takes on the Halfway Crooks, the first of two matchups for those teams. They'll play again in week 7, so we get to see those two teams twice. And for All Waves, they'll get unaffiliated next week, the other 0-3 team. So again, we're going to have a team fall to 2-1 and a team improve to 1-3 next week, whether we like it or not. So that's awesome. Those are going to be great matchups for both of those teams to kind of build some momentum as we head into the, after that, it'll be the second half of the season. Let's kind of keep it rolling on court one. We'll get to the last of the undefeated teams, the Halfway Crooks. As we talked about, 109 points to 82 against the Air Mambas. We'll go Chris first this time on this one. Let me pull these stats up. But it is the Air Mambas falling to 1-2, and so we can kind of talk about them in a second. But the Halfway Crooks, Charles Alexander, walks in the gym after the game has started, and then checks in the game and just really felt like a layup line at times, and that's not, to knock the Air Mambas when, he's super long, athletic, and a lot of times can take advantage of that going to the basket. So it's what happened a lot last year, and it's coming, and it's difficult to stop. So Charles Alexander, picking up where he left off. Charles Correa, shout out, 29 points. Ethan Alexander did his thing as well. And, Jared Hansen early kind of got it going for the Halfway Crooks. But Chris, I know a big first quarter, and it comes in bunches, but talk about the Halfway Crooks in this one and how they were able to get a 17-point lead after the first quarter.
I think the biggest thing the Halfway Crooks did was they just established their dominance. They were just a better team at hitting the boards than the other team was. I don't know what the specific reason was behind it, but like I talked about, having the former MVP of the last season come back and Charles Alexander being on that team definitely doesn't hurt. So I think him just being on the court is just such a presence. And he's just so much bigger, like we said, than a lot of the other guys in the other team. So like that helped a lot. It just pretty much seemed like in the first quarter, a lot of the shots they were just going down no matter what happened. I think that they just had like a better understanding of what they were trying to do than the Air Mambas did.
Yeah, and so Ryan, I mean, I know you were on the other court, so you may have seen the Air Mambas previously, but I'll kind of give you some of their stats, and a lot of it very up-paced, fast-paced game as kind of both teams just getting out and running. And I think that actually favors the Halfway Crooks in that from what I saw, in that kind of up and down and let's try to both score, and get to 100. I think that favors the Halfway Crooks more than the Air Mambas. Not saying they can't score that much. I mean, Mario Valerio 21, Luis Ramirez again, 19 and 8. So he's kind of been very consistent down low. And Mark DaCosta had 5 threes on his way to 19 points. So Anthony Ramsey with 18 as well. I always feel bad leaving out some of the guys who score close to 20 when I'm rattling off the stats here. But a lot of those points, coming, not when the game was over, because right out of halftime, Ryan, we talked about this kind of before going, live here. It was a double-digit game at halftime. The Air Mambas made some threes right out of the break and cut it to 12, 13, or 14. I mean, they were making a little run, and then the Halfway Crooks kind of, turned it back on and played them even in that second quarter. And then the Halfway Crooks did outscore them by 7 in that third quarter, despite that early run by the Air Mambas. So I guess I'll kind of flip it on you. What did the Air Mambas do for that little stretch? Was it just hitting shots? Because sometimes that happens, right? One team makes 3 in a row and the other team misses 3 or 4 in a row, and that's how a run can happen. Or was it something else that kind of maybe gives you a little bit of hope for the Air Mambas going forward?
I think it was just the aggressiveness that they were trying to go for. I don't believe it was anything out of desperation, but I think it's more the fact that they were getting the open shots. Halfway didn't play the 3-ball defensively very well to start off the third quarter, and I think that's kind of the advantage that the Mambas used. They exposed the weakness, so they they used it. They exploited the weakness and they got the job done a little bit until halfway decided to just put the nail in the coffin later in the game.
And we talked about how Lob City made 1-3 in week 3, right? The halfway crooks will need to fix that defensive thing, or that thing they were attempting to call defense in week 3, as they get ready for Lob City in week 4, because that is a whole different a beast. And I'm sure, because the players on the halfway crooks have played in the league before, many of them, they understand that, and it's a totally different game. Week 4 will be a mini preview. I think week 7 maybe will be more of a preview of kind of what it looks like in the playoffs. And I say this throughout the season. We get to the playoffs and I go, see, I told you so. But it's so funny how, let's take this game, right? Air Mambas halfway crooks. Ryan said it, so I don't have to, right? Not a lot of defense by the halfway crooks. I think for stretches of that game, it was just more of, let's just outscore you, and then that should work, right? And we'll kind of take the result with that. In the playoffs, if this game was moved to the end of the season in the playoffs, it would look very, 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 very different. And we're going to get a glimpse of that as these undefeated teams play each other, because it ratchets up the intensity. And then both teams, I swear, are playing defense. And it's like, it feels like a real basketball game, except the guy just dunked on somebody else, the play before, right? Like, that's the only difference, because everything else feels like, you have to execute, you got to set pick and rolls, you have to rebound, right? Like all of the things in a real basketball game, even though the rim is lower here, come into play. And it's so funny. Let me just get this out now. How much the game slows down in a close game in the playoffs versus even in a close game in the regular season. It's just different. And it's so funny how those fast break opportunities, even for the halfway crooks, as good as they are as getting out and running, as good as Lob City is get it out, getting out and fast break and running, there's an emphasis on stopping that, right? And so you'll see it a little bit in week 4, but especially in the fourth quarter of a close game in the playoffs, or in a game that feels like the playoffs, it is unbelievably crazy how much there is zero fast breaks. And sure, there's a leak out here or there because the ball, you get a long rebound off a 3. That's not what I mean. It is crazy how much both teams have to execute. So I will stop preaching, but that is what we have to look forward to in week 4 in the playoffs, which is a lot of fun between these really good teams. Let's preview for the Air Mambas next week. They do take on the Road Dogs, as we talked about, so we love that. And then they will take on All Waves for the first of 2 times in week 5. So they get that team twice, which would be a good matchup. We talked about the halfway crooks getting Lob City next week, and then unaffiliated in week 5. So let's get to unaffiliated. There you go. I found a way to transition this, who did come up short against the Regulators in our game of the week. 2 0-2 teams coming in. It is the Regulators who execute and pull it out by 6. They get their first win. And really, Justin Titsworth after the game really talked about how, they made some shots, they executed, and it was a really, really big win for them. And they, they won the fourth quarter by 4 points and won the game by 6, right? So I'm going to put Chris on the spot here again a little bit, even just to talk about, the Regulators and kind of what you've seen from them, whether it's in this game, and I'll come back to this game in a second, but even just throughout the season. They lost by 1 in week 1, right? In week 2, they played Lob City and lost by double digits, which happens, right? And then here they get a win. So 1 and 2, are they the lone? Oh, sorry, they're 1 of 3 1-2 teams. So, but they get there after winning in week 3, while the other teams lost in week 3 that are 1 and 2. So they get the win. Chris, even just talking on the stats really quick on this one, I know you didn't see a lot of it, but we do have the streams now, which we love. So, what'd you see from the Regulators as they get their first win?
The biggest thing with the Regulators is that the game went entirely the way they probably wanted it to. I think that they're a big defensive team, and the fact that it was a low-scoring game definitely was in their favor. As in the other games, I know they've put up a lot of points, but that's probably just because of the level of the opponent they have played, being the 2 of the 3 undefeated teams so far. And this is just a complete difference of the last game we saw. We talked about not a lot of defense. This is probably one of the most closely contested games this year so far, just defensively. Only 28 threes were even attempted in the whole game. And for the first half, obviously the game was only 2-point game, but I think the biggest thing that we saw from the second half from the Regulators, like you talked about, was Justin, and him making 4 threes was probably the biggest thing. Them having 2 double-digit scores was a big thing, and they also just had a lot of points from their whole team. So I think they were the more deeper team than unaffiliated was. And seeing regulators play a couple of times beforehand, I know what they're capable of. And I think they finally showed what they're capable of. I think they had the best kind of game for them to finally be able to show that they're a deep team and they can play a lot of defense and they don't necessarily need to rely on the three as much as maybe another team used to, as long as they're just physical about it and can play defense and can kind of get back in transition defense and make advantage of fast break points. They can continue the success they had tonight or last night.
And I think that's huge. I mean, you talked about, 28 threes being attempted. I don't know why I know this so quickly, but the halfway crooks and Air Mambas combined to make 27 threes, right? In that game, which is a totally different game, like we talked about. But it's funny how the different styles, right, of these teams. Justin Titsworth, like you talked about, 16 points. Tommy McSparren, who I don't believe was there in week 2. So there you go, right? I think we talked about that last week. He came back for 15 points. And for unaffiliated, Eric Fowler and Corey Davis with 11 each. So I know Eric Fowler in his jersey now. So now he is no longer the Celtics jersey guy, which is so funny. But he had a ton of rebounds as well, and has been a good player. Has been consistent for them down low, which is huge. And not to totally skip over this game, but a close win, especially in the fourth quarter. The regulators pull it out and make some plays down the stretch and get their first win. So the regulators next week take on the Gym Rats again, both 1 and 2 teams. So that'll be a game to keep an eye on. A lot of good games next week. And unaffiliated takes on All Waves, who are also 1 and 2. No, sorry. They're both 0 and 3. I apologize. They are both 0 and 3, and one of those teams will be getting their first win next week. So that's what we have to look forward to in week 4. Guys, good job breaking down week 3. We're not done yet. Let's talk about it. All right. You guys have seen pieces of Lob City. You've seen pieces of the halfway crooks, even if it was just this 1 week. I'm putting you on the spot. So here we go. Okay. These teams played last year in the finals. Okay. So a finals rematch. Both teams very different, I will say. So even though it is a rematch and there is some players coming back for both teams look different. So I don't know how much we can go back to that, but it's just something to point out. I'm not sure if the halfway crooks have ever beaten Lob City. There's a chance that's a no, and I'm sure the Cody Crawford on Lob City will be able to tell me very easily if he has ever lost to the halfway crooks. I maybe once, and I played on the halfway crooks the entire time, and I'm not sure. So it's probably 0 times that the halfway crooks have beaten Lob City. But we'll go Ryan first. He doesn't look ready, but that's okay. We're gonna put him on the spot. I'm kidding. Make a pick. Okay, Lob City and the halfway crooks, and why, and what you expect to see when they face off in week 4.
I expect these two teams just to be killing each other. This is going to be a very good game. This is going to this could be a game of the week. Do we see overtime? It's a possibility. I think right now these teams have to just be playing smart, eliminate the fouls, keep playing defense. I think it's what both teams are known for doing. And I think with bringing in someone like Anderson, I think this kind of can give the Crooks maybe a victory here if things are done right. If they eliminate the turnovers, eliminate the mistakes, I think that we get a halfway Crooks victory here.
And not to harp on last season as much as I tend to do, because I just have that side of things that you guys weren't around for. Charles Alexander did play Lob City in week 3 on a different team, totally different cast of characters, playing alongside him, but a very good team, a team that finished as the 1 seed, I believe, with 1 loss, or the 2 seed. I mean, they were a top seed for sure. 1 or 2 losses. They might have lost in that final week of the season, but they lost to Lob City in week 3 by 5 points. In what was a very close game that was a huge test. And Charles Alexander, despite being one of the only bigger players on that team against a Lob City team that has that size we've talked about, he still was able to affect that game. So I think foul trouble is going to be huge. That's a great point by Ryan, especially with a Lob City team that, wants to attack as much as they do. Part of what comes with that is getting your opponent in foul trouble. So that's going to be huge. And, not that it's ever on the refs, but, just want to see these two teams battle it out, right? And the foul's a foul, but obviously, the last thing you want is for, either team to be without some of their players because of foul trouble. And I think that's fair. Chris, all right. So Ryan, I zoned out. I don't know why. Who'd you pick?
I got halfway, and if I can see overtime, if overtime happens, and I would not be surprised because these two teams are very good teams. They, like I said, they know how to play the ball. They know how to play defense. They're very smart with their shots. They don't go too fancy until they really are able to. But I think when you look at Lob City did a lot, driving to the paint, being very kind of conservative when it comes to those threes, like kind of leaving it alone unless they really need to. And you see Lob City, they're not known to be 3-point shooters, but at the end of the day, they kind of made it a mission to go in, drive to the hoop more often, draw fouls, which they were able to do successfully last night. And I think with halfway, they're kind of one of those teams where I'm like, okay, we can also draw fouls, we can also go to the line, we can make our free throws, and I think this is what makes a great game between these teams.
All right. He made a pick. It's an interesting choice. I love it. All right. Chris. So who do you got? And yeah, go ahead. Give me some analysis on this one.
So kind of going off of what Ryan just said, I completely agree with what he said. Defensive battle, both of these teams are gonna be able to show up defensively, like probably for the first time this season. Obviously, a lot of games that they've had have been kind of on more blowout, but both these teams are probably the most physical. And like we talked about with Charles Alexander, he's gonna finally be able to somebody who's gonna be able to match up with the big guys that Lob City has, like number 15 of Lob City, but his name is blanking me right now. So I think as long as these teams can just keep this game like Ryan was saying, they're gonna try and go to the basket a lot and try to draw fouls from each other. And I think Lob City is obviously the more physical team maybe than Halfway Crooks might be. But Halfway Crooks is obviously I think they're a more explosive team than maybe the Lob City might be. So I think if they can kind of keep the game close and maybe rely on some fast breaks or in-game transitions or anything like that, they can keep the game close. But I think that Lob City might be able to come away with the game as it goes on if they're able to keep up with how like just how tough they're being, because I know like we talked about before, they have a lot of good players on their team. They're probably one of the most deep teams. I know they have Connor Burns, they have Cody Crawford, they have Carney Crawford, and they have Rayvon Dunbar. So I think if they can work together and they can just be physical and they can try and force Charles Alexander to have to pass the ball up to some other guys on their team, they might be able to squeak out a win.
And yeah, I mean, one of those guys will be Charles Correa, right? Who also had a couple games against Lob City. I can't remember if he was at all of those games, but his team played Lob City 3 times last year. He might have been only at one of them, but he's played Lob City before, and so he's going to be a huge X factor as well. It's going to be so interesting, and of course, I'm biased, right? So wait, who'd you pick, Chris? After all that,
I think Lob City's gonna get to do it.
all right. Good. It's not the post game show jinx. I love it. Thank you so much. We don't need everyone on. There's not enough room on the bandwagon yet for the whole crew here. But no, it's so funny. Last year, I mean, the Halfway Crooks were arguably a bigger team than Lob City, and so size wise, that's not exaggerating. I mean, they were able to go lineups of, and I'll mention names that some of the players will remember: Jeff Winchell, Dom Langston, Devin Devon Pina, and then insert your fourth guard here. And so that was a bigger lineup that did give Lob City some issues. And I feel like somebody was missing from that game when they played Lob City in week 4 or 5 for the Halfway Crooks. There's a chance that Lob City never even really played that full bigger lineup. Either way, this is a different Halfway Crooks team, just personnel wise. And so it's funny that Chris kind of goes into that fast break side of things. I can't remember a Halfway Crooks team that has wanted to get out and run as much as this team. And I love it. I mean, that's what the league is about and how you kind of get those leads and go on those runs. That's what Lob City wants to do as well, right? And so it's two teams who are comfortable playing that pace, which is fun, but also interesting on like which side prevails, right? And then you talk about attacking the basket versus maybe some of the more 3-point happy triggers for the Halfway Crooks so far. The Lob City will shoot threes, I promise. Wait till you see them this week. They will take them because they'll have to kind of stretch that defense out to then be able to attack it, right? But the Halfway Crooks take a ton more just through the first 3 weeks so far. So how does that balance out, right? 3 is worth more than 2, but you're supposed to make the 2-pointers at a higher rate than 3s, right? And so it goes back to kind of all of the same basketball things we hear about it in the NBA. It's so funny. So, all right. 1 pick for the Halfway Crooks, 1 pick for Lob City. I'm not making a pick. I'm biased. I'm not allowed to make a pick on the show. So it stays even. That's what we call a game of the week. That's awesome. And guys, very good job on the post-game show. We have a top plays of the week coming up. Power rankings coming up where the top 3 probably won't change. So I'm not breaking any news there, but maybe some of the other teams will kind of shuffle themselves around. And yeah, week 4. I mean, just to kind of go over the matchups again, we talked about Lob City, Halfway Crooks. We talked about All Waves unaffiliated, 2-0-3 teams, Road Dog and Air Mambas could be I think a friskier game than the records might show. And then Regulators, Gym Rats are both 1-2. So a loaded week 4. Whoever did that schedule knows what the heck they're doing. Let me just say, and kind of planning this out. It's always nice to have these matchups now rather than week 1, right? Just because teams are trying to figure themselves out. It's nice to have some close games as we get into this middle part of the season. So Chris, Ryan, good job. I'm Joey. Thanks for watching the post-game show, and we'll see you in Tiverton at Longplex on Tuesday night for week 4.